Welcome to our introduction of Romanticism. This is the cultural and literary era that comes after Neoclassicism. So if you can think back to the works we read by Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, Ben Franklin, and the beliefs that they represented in their works, and the historical events that signified their works, we're moving beyond that into this next unit. Please take notes, because you could use those notes on a quiz in class tomorrow. No screenshots, they have to be handwritten. I highly recommend that. It's not required, but I highly recommend it. Okay, here we go. So, what you'll probably tend to notice in this class as we learn about these different literary and cultural time periods is that each subsequent movement is a lot of times a reaction against the previous one. So Romanticism is in a lot of ways a knee-jerk reaction to the beliefs of Neoclassicism. So if you can think back to what Neoclassicism was all about, it was logic, order, simplicity, those kinds of beliefs. The scientific revolution occurred in conjunction with Neoclassicism, for example. The time period we're looking at here is the early 1800s up to the start of the Civil War, which was the official end of Romanticism, for reasons that may be kind of obvious to you. But we'll talk more about that at a later time. Some of the key beliefs we're starting to see into the 19th century, we're starting to see the rapid growth of cities, factory life and factory work is replacing jobs that had existed for centuries before that, where if you were a worker, you basically specialized in creating one thing. Well, now we have the production line, and you, as a factory worker, are sort of a replaceable cog in a machine. So that's happening. The Industrial Revolution is happening, and Romanticism is not okay with either of those things. They see them as dehumanizing. So going along with that, we also see fascination with, even a celebration of, common people, blue-collar type workers, farmers. And there's also the idea of searching for identity for individuals as well as the nation, as we'll see later. So we're going to start to see a lot of fascination with nature. There's a group of romanticists who believe that we should leave our cities and our communities and go out into nature to get to truly experience life. And that's maybe a more extreme example of this, but we're going to see this thread throughout Romanticism. Neoclassicism was all about logic, was all about reason. Romanticists don't really see that as something worth pursuing. Instead, they're going to push people to examine their emotions and to write about their emotions. Neoclassicism was about coming together as a group. We'll still see some of that in Romanticism, as I'll show you examples of later, but there's also a greater emphasis on the individual and the individual making their own decisions and experiencing life for himself or herself. Just like we saw with the common man, farmers, people like that being celebrated, we'll see a lot of literature set in these very humble settings. Romanticists believe that's where you can find answers to life's greatest mysteries. It's not by studying the workings of the universe. It's not by figuring out, using the scientific method to discover the mysteries of life, like the Neoclassicists might have believed. It's by examining everyday occurrences, common settings, common people. So there is this sense of dissatisfaction. There's a sense of unrest as Romanticists search for meaning as society develops in a way that they see as sort of dehumanizing. So historically, why did Romanticism begin? Well, the main reason is the ultimate failure of the French Revolution, right? So if you think back to Neoclassicism, the American Revolution was a product of neoclassicism. The Declaration of Independence and even the Constitution are quintessential neoclassic documents. It was a revolution based on, as they saw it, reason and logic, and a reaction against monarchy and the divine right of kings, and a celebration of democracy. Well, they attempted to follow those tenets, those beliefs, at the start of the French Revolution, and without going into too much detail, that revolution becomes just a bloodbath, and a lot of horrible things happen, which all eventually lead to the rise of Napoleon and many years of war. Compared to what happened here, not that the American Revolution was an instant success and everything was okay, but things went a lot smoother on this side of the Atlantic, and therefore Romanticists looked at the failure of the French Revolution and said, well, people were following the same tenets of neoclassicism that got us the American Revolution, and look what it led to, so clearly that's not the answer. Some of the other beliefs of Romanticism that are worth knowing is that they believe that people are ultimately good at heart, but society corrupts them. There is an interest in psychology before psychology is even really a thing, before it's a proper science, really. And we'll actually look at some stories that deal with some deep psychological issues without really knowing that, or without really consciously being aware of they're exploring this idea of psychology. We'll look at a story that deals with suppressed emotions and these different aspects of the human mind, id, superego, and ego, which are ideas that Freud would come up with, or at least name later on in the 19th century, but you have these writers exploring the very same ideas, which is fascinating. So who are the Romanticists? Well, there are three main groups of them, and the first group we'll refer to simply as the early Romanticists, and we'll read a couple of short stories by these guys. William Cullen Bryant was a poet. We'll read a few selections from him later in the semester. James Fenimore Cooper is a name that you might know because he was actually born in South Jersey before moving, and he wrote The Last of the Mohicans, which was turned into a film with Daniel Day-Lewis, which is part of the Leatherstocking Tales. Washington Irving is another famous early Romanticist. This group was known as the Knickerbocker Group in total. They were all from New York, or at least worked in New York. And these guys were really interested in, so we're a newly independent nation. What is our defining culture? What are our defining features and characteristics? So then they want to establish that sense of American culture. So we'll read a couple of stories and poems by these guys. The second group, we'll obviously also read some stories from this group as well, are the Gothics. And they're very interested in, like I said before, psychology, but sort of, before, again, psychology was really, something that you could go to school to study before it was its own thing. And some of these famous names are Edgar Allan Poe, of course, Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, which is a great book we will not read in this class because it would take us an entire marking period. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, he wrote The Scarlet Letter, among other amazing short stories, which we'll read in this class. And then finally, the third group are the Transcendentalists, and I made brief reference to these guys earlier in the presentation. They're the ones who believed that if you want to live a life worth living, you need to leave society and embrace nature. So that was an idea that Ralph Waldo Emerson came up with, and his protege was Henry David Thoreau, who, in addition to having an amazing beard, if you want to call it amazing, he also left society and did his best to live by himself in nature at this place called Walden Pond, and we'll read some excerpts from his experience there at the pond. As idealistic as these guys were, it's not too much to say that their ideals were essentially doomed to failure. maybe that's something that you can argue with me, and we will talk about and decide on later. But they are so idealistic. They so believe in the idea of establishing these communes in the middle of nowhere, but none of them really panned out. So something to keep in mind. Another phenomenon to be aware of that was going on during the Romanticist era was transatlantic literature. So after the war ended and trade with England normalized, the United States would import tons of literature, tons of books from England. And what tended to happen was these American authors, like I said before, Washington Irving and the other Knickerbocker group, the early Romanticists, tried to fix this problem, but we kind of lacked an identity. We didn't really know, what do we write about? What is quote unquote American? What does that even mean? So a lot of the most popular books during this time period were not that original, and a lot of times tended to copy whatever was happening in England, whatever was popular in England. So this book called Ivanhoe, which was about medieval England and Robin Hood and that cast of characters, written by this guy, Sir Walter Scott, was basically the blueprint for James Fenimore Cooper, the author of the Leatherstocking Tales, Last Mohicans. His books are very much written in the style, the voice, the structure of Scott's Ivanhoe. So there's an ongoing debate about, what is the first great American novel? Has there ever been a first great American novel? And as entertaining as some of these early books by James Fenimore Cooper may have been, they're struggling to get to that point, to make something that's uniquely American and isn't just a rehash of what's happening in England. So the last slide that I want to show you guys is about Washington Irving, because we will read one of his short stories to kick off our unit on Romanticism. He's a celebrated early American author. He wrote Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. And as I had mentioned before, one of his goals as a writer was to create this, to try to capture the concept of what it means to be American. What is the cultural identity? What is an American mythology that we can call our own that isn't just something we're copying from England? So we'll actually read one of his stories to, like I said, to kick off the unit. And that's something to be thinking about as you read it, something that we can debate as a class is, is he doing something that's uniquely American, or is it not so original? And if it is uniquely American, then what about it makes it so? Something to be thinking about. Well, that's it for the presentation. Again, please make sure that if you haven't done so already, that you do take notes, as you will be able to use those notes on a short quiz on Romanticism. But good luck, and I will see everyone soon. Bye.